and welcome everyone. Today, I'm very excited. I have a very special guest who's joining me, and his name is Omar. Omar from All Rounder Cycles.
Defunct.
Defunct. Well, maybe we'll have time to talk about that.
In hibernation, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to introduce Omar because I know some of the viewers of this channel have met and seen Omar, but maybe they don't actually have a real, background understanding of who you are. So let me attempt my best at introducing you. If I make any mistakes, correct me. But let me see if I can do a proper introduction for Omar here. So Omar is a bicycle right now. Would you say you're a bicycle mechanic now? Is that a good title?
Profession, yes. I'm still a bicycle mechanic.
Okay. But your background, is you started off doing bicycle repair stuff way back. You started your first bike kind of repair shop when you were even before high school. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, yeah, it was before high school. 1980, 1989, 90 or something like that, with a friend of mine, across the street neighbor. Start out with ping pong, then BB guns, and then bike repair. Started tearing bikes apart in his garage, and then decided to tune up everyone's bike in the neighborhood, and that's when it started. And yeah, paid off a bunch of bike tools. We didn't really make a dime otherwise.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So you have a long history of doing bike repair, and then you went to college. You went to UC Berkeley and got a degree in philosophy, if I'm not mistaken.
It's called Peace and Conflict Studies. Yeah, it's in the internet. It was in the International Studies department, but Peace Studies is a short name for it.
Yeah, and then from there, or around that time, you were working for several different bike brands and bike shops. You worked. You also worked at a bike manufacturer, and it was called. Shoot, the name's slipping my mind.
I'm going to say, or you want to guess it?
Yeah.
Valaji. Yeah.
Valaji.
Yeah. It was in up near you, Katati, for a while.
Yeah, and so that company manufactured bikes. They designed bikes, and you were involved in the design and production of those bikes. Is that right?
Yeah. Technically not involved in the design, but a bit in the production. Like the two designers worked it out, and I said that's not going to work because of this mechanical reason. Like I brought in the mechanical end of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you somewhere between there and starting your own shop and having your own your own company, your own bike repair shop in Emeryville, you worked with Bruce Gordon Cycles in Petaluma. You've worked with Rivendell over in the East Bay, or I guess over in Walnut Creek.
Walnut Creek, yeah.
And a few other bike shops. One was in Oakland. I think it was the one you sent me down there one day to check it out, and because they were selling the shop and they were liquidating. And
yeah, Manifesto. Yeah. They're sort of legendary for like kind of counterculture fixed gear stuff at first, but just a whole lot of style, zero concern with watts per kilo. Which is exactly what I needed from a shop.
Yeah. Because there wasn't a lot of those shops at that time, right? That was kind of unusual for.
Well, I think there was like the 2008 stock market crash was sort of like the birthplace of a whole generation of like cycling enthusiasm, and the simplicity of the fixed gear like might be similar to a bit of now, this like kind of crash in the whole system, and people really hopped on bikes. And that's when I think that shop really took off, because bike culture, fixed gears, simplifying life, like bringing it down to the bare bones. I feel like minimalism kind of took off. And so that was its heyday from about 2008 to, I'd say, 2012, 2013. And then things started to turn a different direction and head towards 650B gravel bikes, which is not what they were up to, not what they wanted to do. So anyway.
And then at some point you decided to go out and start a mobile bike repair shop. And that's what then led you into a more kind of brick and mortar bike shop where you actually have a location and you started building bikes for people. You were doing lots of bike restoration projects. I remember you were painting, doing like a whole painting program. And that's when I found you. I found you through Eli at Ruthworks.
Oh, wow.
He posted a photo of himself at your shop, and I had somehow discovered Eli through the the randoneering community, and I saw you were in the East Bay and you were working on bikes that looked really interesting, kind of things I was interested in at that time. And I remember telling Miss Cools, I was like, we got to go over to All Rounder because she was living near you. And
Right.
yeah,
You were up in Cazadero still. And
yeah. So
yeah.
that's when this whole thing with getting my custom built bike, and and I came down to your shop and I really wanted that advice, which has been so I wanted help with the build, but I just in the process I realized not just the help that I needed for that, but I realized how much knowledge you have on so many bike related things. I wanted to kind of tap into it, and
Yeah.
It was
Well, I just remember it was all such a fun conversation. I don't know what I tell you, and I don't know what comes across as helpful, but it's fun to chat about all of it. And I should say, around that time you probably found out about me through Eli. I was spying your Instagram, feeling like I wanted to build bikes like your was it a Specialized Expedition? I'm like, I was really into your bike.
really.
I was hoping to do more non-disc brake bikes, but business really wouldn't allow me to. Like everyone wanted a 650B disc bike.
I remember that was a really hot thing for a while.
Yeah.
A lot of the 650B rando bikes with disc brakes
Yeah.
took off. That was really popular for a while.
Yeah, I mean, and for good reason. It's like a pretty solid setup, though. Something about the way these old bikes, there was something kind of awesome about restoring bikes. But I remember we were probably mutually spying on each other's photos and being like, we got to check this out, And so
Yeah.
I was really happy when you guys came in. I couldn't quite believe it. I'm like, whoa, it's
Really?
these two like internet famous people.
Oh, wow.
But quickly, you guys are so down to earth. It kind of felt like you're just old friends pretty quickly. But
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
we also share a lot of things. I think we kind of had sort of parallel youth, I would say. You grew up in the Bay Area mostly, and you did a lot of the similar stuff I did. And so I immediately connected with you because I think we've just done a lot of things very similar. I mean, you're really good. I remember you posted some videos of yourself skateboarding.
oh yeah, we kind of came from similar backgrounds in that regard, huh?
Yeah.
Dating and then bikes and
Yeah.
technical engineering type thingies. And I don't know, you went into engineering. I went into like geeking out on bikes, but similar kinds of minds, I feel like. Kindred spirits, perhaps.
Yeah.
For sure. And then just the fact that you were in Katati in the North Bay, working on bikes, riding on some of the same roads I was riding on.
Oh, yeah.
And yet we never crossed paths in all of that. It's interesting.
Different worlds.
Yeah. So, first of all, really thank you. I want to thank you very, very much for doing this and coming on. I mean, it's a real honor to have you here, Omar, and to do this with me. Yeah, I mean it's really cool. I think a lot of people who are watching are gonna really value what information you have. And so anyway, so today what I was thinking we could talk about, without going on too long here, is I wanted to talk about brakes. You mentioned it already that you were doing a lot of disc brake stuff, and the rim brake things have been more or less sort of pushed aside. But you have a ton of experience, working on rim brake bikes and studying them and figuring out how to make them better. And I've scoured through the internet and looked for information myself on, how to get better braking. What are the things, how do you actually adjust them? And a lot of that is because most of my bikes, until the Specialized, were caliper brakes, zero space, zero clearance, short reach, caliper brakes. And, they've been they're really simple to set up. There isn't a whole lot of adjustability, and they generally work really well. But then you get into like cantilever brakes and center pull brakes and V brakes, and all of a sudden there's a lot more happening. Oh, shoot, my phone's ringing there. Yeah, Monday is always a day of, work gets in the way of our fun. So, so let's see. We were going to talk about brakes, and I was thinking what I would like to do is get your philosophy on brakes and then get some kind of tips on how we could apply that to our brakes, or, my brakes, or whoever's watching their brakes. Just first the philosophy, and then maybe get into some specifics. What do you think about that format?
Yeah, I've never thought of myself as having a philosophy about brakes, but maybe I'll uncover one. Talk
Well,
about it.
maybe philosophy is too big of a word to use, but
Take on it. My take.
yeah.
Well, yeah, this all stemmed from the Instagram post about the different leverages for all these varieties of road levers, which I posted because I just think that's interesting, like road leverage or short pull. Like, just start there. There's brakes that pull more cable than others. Like when you pull the lever, some brakes like pull more cable than others, and that I think has a huge, actually it's not just I think, it just the physics of it shows that it has a huge effect on how much power you get to the brakes. So I think when I was showing that, really what I'm talking about is how do you get more power to the brakes? Because the more baseline problem is with rim brakes is you don't have enough power. And so I thought that was just an interesting thing. Like, look, depending on what lever you're using to what caliper, your power is going to feel different. They're not all the same. So if you're experiencing not enough power, consider this: how much leverage do you have? And with once the jump has been made to V brakes and disc brakes, well, you could argue that there's not enough power with some disc brakes. That's probably more just it's the same problem in a way of like not having the right match of caliper and lever. I kind of feel like in most cases, but V brakes was sort of the opposite problem, where you had too much power. And so between moving from the world in the 90s was like cantilever brakes, and then the later 90s was V brakes dominated the things, and then the mountain bike sort of like gave way to the disc brake, and we sort of we were allowed to just sort of forget about braking, because rim brakes isn't a thing to worry about anymore. And then on the road end, I think things just got better, like with the dual pivot brakes, and Shimano adding like almost like not a triple pivot, but they kind of mirrored the same. I don't know, if you look at a dual pivot brake, from the early 2000s versus one you see now, there's more leverage in the new brakes. So I feel like the roady end of things just got better in the rim world. rim brake world. And the rest of us are, a lot of us don't have new road bikes, and a lot of us are still trying to run big tires, which, like the new good road rim brakes, they're useless to us. We're trying to run like 700 by 32s in a lot of cases, or bigger. And a lot of us don't want to run disc brakes for a variety of reasons. So I feel like this kind of smattering of different road levers was like, I feel it sort of addresses the fact that I've been working on bikes that are neither road racing bikes nor hydraulic disc bikes. And this is the problem here, which I saw. Like, a lot of people with road bikes, road levers, and a lot of times the bikes come in for repair, and I'm like, I can't believe you're dealing with this. Like, and I try not to make a big deal out of it, because people adapt and they just squeeze harder or whatever. And I don't want to bum people, like, I don't want to make people get psyched out by their equipment. Like, I like it when people don't even know, in a sense, like when they're oblivious, because that just means more attention on the experience of biking. But sometimes, like, they get a hint, like, you know what? Yeah, my hands are too small. I can't really squeeze this thing. Or I'm like coming down some hill or something. And then I feel like I have things to say, but a lot of times I don't try to make a big deal out of it. But leverage is sort of the thing, getting more power into your rim brakes. And I just feel like that's what's not going to be in Bicycling Magazine anymore, or that's not what GCN is going to be talking about, because no one's talking about your old bike in a way.
Yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking about my experience that I had when I first set up the rim brakes on the rando bike using center poles. And my experience with center poles up to that point were limited to a set of center-mounted center poles on the vintage Bianchi that I rode at Arroyoca. And I had great braking with it. I thought it was incredible. I couldn't believe these brakes. They actually were better than my short reach, zero clearance road brake, caliper brakes.
Yeah.
At least at that time, because I was probably comparing them to brakes road brakes.
The 10-speed mono era, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And pads that are, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about, what are the best brake pads to put on a rim brake bike. Like you just adapt. You pull a little harder if they don't stop you as fast. And you build up your forearms from gripping. And so you just get used to it.
Or there's actually a thing with road brakes, I find you don't really squeeze at all. You actually turn your wrist.
Yeah.
And so I think people just learn to do that, and to the degree that they don't get into trouble, things are fine.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And then when I brought that Brazon mounted center pole bike down to your shop to put it together, and I was trying to get the brakes set up, and there's so many adjustable points on that. You've got the distance between the pad and the rim. That's one adjustment. But because they're mounted on these posts that can rotate and slide simultaneously, and the toe in and toe out can be adjusted with those washers. It's just, once you loosen them, it's all over the place. And that was a new kind of a real difficult. I had done a little bit of that on my cantilever brakes, so they were similar. But, there's a lot of adjustability. And when you start studying the articulation of those calipers and trying to figure out where to adjust things, and how close should they be, and what kind of levers. And, nowadays we're mixing and matching Shimano stuff with old Suntour stuff, with old Mayfac stuff. And who knows if any of it was actually compatible. And some of it is, but some of it's even more compatible than other stuff. And so when you were explaining that, I was thinking about how if the leverage on the brake lever is really high, it pulls a very short amount of cable. And so what happens is the lever will bottom out on the handlebar before it engages the brake. So the way to adjust, like, if you're just me thinking, not you, but me thinking, oh, well, it's bottoming out. I need to tighten that. I need to pull that cable in a little bit. I need to pull those brakes closer to the rim. Well, by doing that, the caliper changes its angle, which lowers its leverage, right? As those angles, because it's sweeping through an arc. The pad is sweeping through this arc. And if you're too close, and the pad's not set correctly on the caliper, it's starting to push either up or push down depending on the kind of brake, and you're not getting the same amount of lateral force on the rim.
Well, actually, you might be actually getting more leverage, but yeah, you're right. It might be pushing kind of up in an up angle, like towards the tire instead of directly in at the rim. And you might actually be getting more leverage in some cases, but well, in your case, it looked like the problem was you couldn't, like with center pull brakes, since the arms swing from the top, and as you open them up, that upper arm wants to, like right here, wants to swing down into the fender.
Yeah.
It's like only so much you can, there's only so much you can open them up before you can't open them up anymore, because that upper lever is touching the fender. I mean, there's some issues, but if we can just like kind of back up,
Sure.
like what we're talking about, like on a very fundamental level, I feel like just looking at a road brake, like just examine a road brake, like just a road brake, rim brake, front brake. Just take a look at that in almost every case. Like you just go to a new bike shop, squeeze the front brake, squeeze the rear brake on a rim brake bike. The front always feels better. Why does the front always feel like it's more firm? It's for one, it's easier to pull. Second, there's not as much like squish and gush in the brake. It's just not spongy feeling. And well, sort of not related, but the front brake always has more effect. Almost always, I should say. Sometimes it doesn't. I don't actually know why, but the front brake has more power. But I think the front brake illustrates what you want to have happen to both brakes. With the front brake, the cable line is the shortest possible distance, right? With a rim brake, it has to be longer. But what you're trying to do is make the rear brake do what the front brake is doing to the best you can, meaning no more housing than you need. And that front brake line from a road brake cable goes like right from the bars right into the lever. There's just like almost like two bends, one bend around the top of the, like from the ramps into the tops of the bar, and another bend straight down into the caliper, right? Two bends, and then you're like done. There's no friction there. So you're trying to like reduce the cable distance by like cutting the housing to the shortest possible without compromising your ability to steer, and then lower the friction as much as possible by minimizing excessive bends. And then that way you don't lose energy in the cable, the housing bending. You don't lose energy in the friction created by trying to drag that cable through the housing. So all that power gets sent to the brake instead. So, and then on the caliper end, the fundamental thing is get the pads to land flat on the rim. If you have to tow like reduce squeal or whatever, do it as little as possible. Optimal is let the brake pad land flat on the rim. And I mean, there's probably another few things, but like right off the bat, like that's what's got to happen. But when it comes to when you bring in the discussion of levers, that's like kind of like advanced level, but like on a very fundamental level, good housing, cut to the right length, low friction, like start there. And until you do those, I don't really think you really know what you have. Like whether you have a good caliper combo or caliper lever combo or not. Okay. Or maybe you do because you have a friend who has the same setup, but until you do those basic things, like you don't really know what you have, because fighting through those two things like cable stuff is like, it's like having awesome computer, like a great computer, but really terrible Wi-Fi. Like you want to get a good connection, you know, and I don't know why that. I used to use that.
That makes a lot of sense. So do you have any?
Is there any difference between cable housings and cables? I see all kinds of things now. I see these Teflon coated cables. I've seen the compressionless housing, and there's different kinds of compressionless housing. Some use like a steel helix inside the actual plastic coating. Others use very like strands of wire that are then coated in plastic and some other liner inside. Do you have any? Are there any real differences to that, or is that all just kind of marketing?
Well, so it's always so there's a difference, I think, in stiffness of the housing. So I'm going to bring up like Jaguar, for instance, is a very common housing that's used in shops, and there's a few others that are very similar. Jaguar housing is like their basic housing, brake housing, is a little bit flexible, and in a way it's kind of nice because it kind of gets around bends really easy. It's actually kind of a great one for tight bent, like bars with really tight radius, like from the ramps to the tops. Some bars are really tight radiuses now, and it's kind of nice to have flexible housing, but you lose some power with flexible housing. And you also, on the other hand, yes, there's, for instance, compressionless housing, and that's being used a lot more now because of disc brakes, or people running full lines, like a full line of housing from the lever to the rear brake. And it's stiffer. It doesn't compress as much. It doesn't like bend. But I do think there's more friction in that housing. So you're kind of balancing like the gains of of stiffness versus the losses of friction, like that because friction degrades brake performance. So what I've found, just as if you want to try it, I'd say try Shimano SP, their SLR housing. Shimano SLR is a really good like basic housing that's better, I feel like, than a lot of lower level, like bottom of the barrel type housing. And in some cases, I feel like better than compressionless housing, depending on how much friction is created between your brake. Some cases, I feel like on some bikes, I've switched out the compressionless housing because it created too much friction, and you gain more by taking out friction and having a little flex. It might depend on your setup, but yeah, the Shimano SLR is a great like baseline if you're like wanting to start somewhere.
Okay.
And what about how to cut the cables and filing the ends and making sure what are your tips on that, I guess? What would you say that's?
Well, yeah, I feel like it's similar to like, why do you like when you land the brake pad flat on the rim, that's what you're trying when you're considering how do I cut the housing, it's the same problem. Like that ferrule, when that housing cap, the ferrule that you put on the housing, if it's not compressing against a flat surface, it's just a little bit lost. And sometimes like the normal, let's just talk about normal brake housing, it's kind of coiled.
Yeah.
Right. And as that coil comes around, if you don't cut it cleanly, sometimes that last little hook will kind of come into the bore and cause friction. And you might not notice it until it's all hooked up and you can't see it. But like the way that housing might exit the cable stop might cause that little bit of coiled housing, that inner, like that kind of supports that inner wire. There's like a nylon liner that runs through the middle of the housing. So it's basically your nylon liner, the metal coil, and then you see the black kind of casing around that. That's like the part you see. But if you don't make sure that bore in the middle is just as clean and open as possible, there's that little chance you might get that little hook a bit of friction that might make the difference between like your brake feeling crisp or the caliper rebounding easily and quickly, or it can be the difference between like having a brake that feels like really crisp and good or not. So yeah, it's pretty important to cut your cable clean. And a lot of cases I don't use, there's like a couple cutters, like there's the kind that kind of cut like this, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and there's the
Shears.
kind that, yeah, there's like flush cuts or
Yeah.
diagonal cutters. I actually prefer to use diagonal cutters on brake housing, and then the housing cutters on derailleur housing,
Okay.
because the way that diagonal cutter, the way it cuts flush, it cuts the that coiled part in exactly where I want it to cut, and I can kind of trim it back with flush cutters. Whereas I feel like if I use housing cutters, I feel like I can't do that as easily. And some people, like we were talking about earlier, you like to grind off that last bit of housing so it's flat.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this like on when you buy housing new, you'll look at the end of it and it's like perfectly flat, like it took it to a grinder and it's super flat. But what I find with that method is I think you have, if you do it right, you did it right. Like you basically, but what you want to do is make sure that inner board where the nylon liner is totally open. But the problem is what can happen sometimes is you go to grind it and the heat from the wheel melts that inner liner, and it, instead of being a dilated, constricts it a little. Like that little nylon just kind of might melt into the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, depending on the angle you're grinding, you might grind towards the middle, and that little bit of metal coil
Mm-hmm.
might be ground towards the bore. So basically, I feel like you don't have to grind it if you can just cut it cleanly. But
Interesting.
yeah, it's more important that you open up that middle bore, I think, than get it perfectly flat. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, I think that's the more important thing. Don't create friction.
Okay. How about metal or some sort of polymer Furel and a plastic Furel? Do you have any thoughts on the differences? Does it matter?
If with coiled housing, I don't really think it matters. I hardly ever see the plastic ones. I think I prefer to not use the plastic ones if I can't, if I can get away with it. Usually metal ones are lying around. Aluminum ones are kind of nice too. They're actually a little bit bigger than most metal and maybe plastic ones. And they slot into the housing stops a little more firmly. But with compressionless housing, always use like the supplied, usually they're aluminum ferrules.
Oh, aluminum. Okay.
The size of there's the ferrule, and there's the little hole where the cable exits. The size of that hole is really important to not mess around with. Like, you don't want to put metal ferrules on compressionless housing, because those little strands have a tendency to burst through the bigger hole that brass or metal ferrules have.
Ferrule.
So,
yeah.
Did I say Furel? I think I always call them Furels.
I call it ferrule.
It's ferrule.
Yeah, it's Ferrel. You got it. I'm really good at looking at words and trying to say them phonetically sometimes. Even though that's not a good example, I think that actually phonetically looks like Ferrule, and I always say Furel. So anyway, let's see. So we talked a lot about just making sure you set the brakes up the best way possible initially to see what you actually have, and then you go from there. You've set up the cables correctly. You've used good cables, good housing. Your pads are aligned correctly. If you try to set them as flat to the rim as possible. If you have squealing, you toe them in a little bit, but just enough to get the squeal to stop. No more, no less.
And usually you toe the front end in, and you leave the back edge of the pad like off by maybe a half millimeter to a millimeter.
Okay.
Just so sometimes people reverse toe and they toe the opposite direction, and that's usually a last resort. But anyway.
Okay.
And then, so then you're riding your bike and you're thinking, okay, it's pretty good, but I think it could be better. So then some more advanced things to look at would be obviously brake dependent, the type of brake you have. But let's talk about center pole brakes and cantilever brakes for this. So what can we do to get those to work? And I've run into where I was trying to set up center poles, and for a while I just wasn't that impressed with them. I tried different pads, different compounds, and I just felt like at that time I just wasn't getting the kind of braking I wanted. When you posted that Instagram story or Instagram post on the different levers and different pull ratios, I swapped to the one that had the highest ratio, a highest leverage ratio. And what happened was I lost cable pull, so I had to really focus in on getting the pads as close to the rim as I could without them rubbing in order to get the brakes to actually engage on the rim while I was pulling it. And I didn't want it to engage near the bottom of the stroke either, because I didn't want that feeling of all of a sudden running out of brakes where you bump into the handlebar. And so what maybe you can explain why that works, and or what I was doing wrong and what I did right the second time.
Well, your brake issue is kind of, it's very like, I think it's pretty unique to your kind of a bike, because, well, maybe there's a lot more center pole 650B bikes going out there, but I feel like that's kind of a tricky one. I sort of feel like you're just sort of pinned by that brake design, like the way like you're talking about when you if you get you wanted to get your caliper arms so they're kind of more vertical, and so when they would sweep, it would be more direct on the rim, but your fender requires you to like scoop it in more so that you get more clearance on the upper end. I don't know, just kind of like gotta bite the bullet on that one. It's just the brakes look awesome. There's nothing you can do about it. I thought maybe like get a wider rim, but no, that doesn't solve your problem either. But I mean, let's just start with you switch to a higher leverage ratio brake. I mean, like if usually the issue is I'm not getting enough power. I mean, rarely with road levers are we talking about like, geez, I'm just getting way too much power. Maybe with Miss Cool's new bike.
Yeah.
But usually that's not the problem. Like a lot of people aren't running the highest leverage lever on the highest leverage caliper. You know, that's kind of what the issue she's in right now, running.
By the way, she's not complaining though. Just want to make that clear. No, she likes that high power, very low pull. You just have to pull hard, and she likes that feeling of getting a lot of brake.
Yeah.
Whereas for me, that's just not what I'm used to. So going from my road bikes and my center pole bikes to that, it's like going from my road rim brake bike to my mountain bike hydraulic disc brake bike, and all of a sudden just having tons of brake.
Yeah. It can be startling if you're not used to it. Or you're nerving. Maybe.
You just don't know how to feather it anymore. It's like your muscle memory is to pull hard, but then all of a sudden you pull and the bike really grabs, and you have to remember to kind of ease up a little bit and not come into a corner fast and be startled by it, and then grab all this brake and slide out, or whatever.
Yeah. And like with all the brakes, like I think we adapt to what we've got. But if you can't seem to adapt, and like in the case of Miss Cools, everything's fine. So we're not trying to do anything to that. But for a lot of folks, it's like, how do I get more power out of this thing? And that's sort of, again, why I posted the differences in the different road leverages. But one thing is, yeah, like look at that list of levers and try to figure out how much leverage yours has. I only posted like really one parameter of that leverage, which is the distance from the pivot of the lever to where it anchors the cable. And that's just like one factor, but it's not the whole story. It's almost also, if I can use this screwdriver, like where my thumb is the pivot. It also might depend, like say this is where it anchors, say the cable's coming in from here. If you start pulling the lever right there, that's one thing. But if the cable is, you start to pull the cable, but it's at this angle, that angle's, there's different like leverage going on there. It's actually higher leverage, but the distance is the same, but it's a higher leverage thing. So, but I didn't really go into that because maybe you can go into that like the angle from the pivot, like that's another determinant, but
Yeah.
So anyway, like just, measure that. And in a lot of cases, without even going into the rest of it, basically the shortest distance between the pivot and the cable anchor, the shorter the distance, the more leverage you'll have. So that's one thing.
So with that point you just made, where you have the lever and the angle, as you're pulling and changing that angle, changing the leverage ratio essentially as you're pulling, are brakes designed in a way where, because some brakes are non-linear, you start to pull and you don't get a lot, and then all of a sudden you get a ton of brakes.
Yeah,
like they're non-linear. Others are very linear. The more you pull, the more you get, the more feedback you get, until and then you can anticipate how much more to pull based on the feedback you're getting from the bike. Yeah. Whereas with a non-linear feedback system, it just all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's not enough. So I need to pull the same amount, but more, twice as much, but you get 4 times as much braking. And that's when you're over the handlebars. Yeah. So with that, is there, I guess maybe this is more of a, another one of those questions. I mean, we're mixing and matching parts nowadays. Are we using things that were designed for different kinds of brakes because of those changes in leverage, those leverage ratios changing as you're pulling the lever? Are we making some incompatible systems here by just virtue of this using one era of part with another era of part, or even another manufacturer or brand of part? Do you think do you bump into that much in your experience?
Yeah, I think that's partly why I'm glad we hold on to things like this old Shimano SLR design, because yes, there may be sort of incompatibilities, but I think we're worried about incompatibilities more when they make it harder for us to stop. Like if it makes it easier for us to stop, we're not usually complaining that much. But it's when we're complaining about an incompatibility, it's because the lever pulls too much cable for the brake. Like for instance, a Shimano SLR brake, like you have on your Fits right now, and you take a Campagnolo lever from like the 1998 to 2008 era, there's a huge difference in the way those like pull through they just feel different. I can barely see. I like measured them and you can look at them close, and it's hard to figure out like why do they feel so different. And the one you have is definitely that. It's like it's designed to kind of pull a little bit more at the beginning, and then it like as you go further back in the travel of the brake lever, it's higher leverage. So it's like I guess you would call that progressive. Is that progressive? Okay.
Yeah.
And whereas the Campagnolo lever is like, it just feels flat. Like it's like, it just feels kind of the same through the whole sweep. And in some cases, it's like, it doesn't feel as good because you don't get that extra punch towards the rear end of the lever pull.
Oh.
And but when you put that Campagnolo lever with a Campagnolo caliper, it feels great. Actually, it feels really good. And you can also take that SLR lever and pair it with a Campagnolo caliper, and it might feel like extra powerful. Or anyway, that SLR lever that you're using, I think is kind of just a problem solver for a lot of there's not enough power in this thing issues.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if that muddies the water anymore, but yeah, I think there's incompatibilities, but typically we solve our complaints by upping the leverage of the brake lever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in terms of with center pole brakes and cantilever brakes, you have a crossover, you have a crossover cable and a yoke.
Yeah.
Is there any advantage to setting the height of the yoke with respect to the brake caliper?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same is true for all center poles. That as a general rule, the more you lower the yoke toward the caliper, the more leverage you're going to get. And you sent me a really good article from Circle A where he super geeks out on that, like the physics and stuff involved in there. But just from my own experience, like I'm like, because being like coming into like my love for cycling was defined cyclocross. For me, that was like, I remember distinctly like falling in love with cyclocross bikes and just getting so into it, like this was in like the late 90s, but realizing how supremely bad the brakes were on all of them. Like cantilevers kind of all sucked. But I love this big tire thing.
Yeah.
But then if you try to put V brakes on to try to get more power, there's this incompatibility between the road levers and the new V brakes. I mean, Miss Cools is riding, but back then I feel like we didn't have mini motos. There was no short arm V brakes at the time. There's just these long ones. So the leverage is always wrong. You almost could never get enough pad clearance. And with cyclocross and dirt, you needed more clearance. And so I felt like cyclocross being so like shaped by the European cyclocross world, they were all about clearance. Like brakes were for having clearance, not for like cantilevers for letting mud go through. They weren't really for like stopping on a dime. And I was always like impressed how some of these incredibly high-end bikes just stopped terribly. Like cantilevers were kind of a mystery. I'm like, why are these so bad? But I think that's when I started really getting interested in like what makes brakes work good, because I feel like there's no choices. We didn't have disc brakes to switch to. Like I said, V brakes weren't that great of an option, but there was the Problem Solvers travel agent. I don't know if you've heard of that little doohickey. Problem Solvers, the company that makes these little great problem solving things for bikes, made a leverage adapter. So it's like a little wheel that like hooked right into the V brake itself, and it kind of helped change the leverage so that you could open up the pads a bit more, still get the good braking, but not have it feel too like sudden a stop. Or it just allowed us to do that, but it was kind of a big ugly looking thing, and a lot of people used them. It's called a travel agent. It basically was an adapter to change the high leverage of the caliper into a lower leverage by the time it got to that V brake caliper. So so what are we talking about here? Cantilevers. So basically trying to figure out how to make a cantilever work better. It seemed to me that there's a couple ways to do it. You lower the yoke as much as possible. And if that doesn't work, you try to open up the brake as much as possible and lower the yoke. Because sometimes when the arms are vertical, if like your cantilever brakes are almost looking like they're V brakes, like they're so vertical, there's not really anything happening. So you almost gotta make your pads stick in towards the brake more and get that arm to come out, and then drop your yoke and then try again. And then usually that's the way to get your cantilevers to work good. And then if that doesn't work for you, like you get luckily now we have, Paul mini motos, basically are V brakes, or V brake or linear pull design, where the cable just pulls straight across the top. It's a super nice design, I feel like, but they're just a shorter caliper arm, so they don't have as much leverage, and which jives better with a lot of road levers. And like there's TRP makes them as well. It's like what's it called, the CX 8.4 or something like that. There's a few short arm linear pull brakes out there now. Tektro has them, but I gotta say, they're not all equal. I'd say err towards spending more money. TRPs are all mini motos if you want like a good one. But then you have that problem with that top cable coming really close to hitting the tire.
Yes.
So that's where I feel like it's good to know a little about cantilevers at that point, like, because you might be able to get some really good power out of the cantilever, but get more clearance. So if you wanted to run a fender over that big old 700 by 40 or 650B by 48 tire, you can get that extra height, get that cable away from the tire. It might be useful to know how to get a cantilever set up properly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should
mention that article I sent to you. I discovered it on the Black Mountain Cycles website. I think it was in one of the posts that they make. I don't know if it's their blog, but it was a discussion on how to improve braking. Black Mountain Cycles is a bike company down here in Northern California, and they do a lot of rim brake bikes, or they used to anyway. And so they were discussing a lot of these topics, and they linked that article. So that's how I found it. And I thought it was really fascinating because that person who wrote the article went into all of the mechanics of different types of cantilever brakes, with the crossover cable height being one of the parameters, and the angle, as you were describing it, the angle of the caliper, and how the leverage changes based on the style, the actual design of the caliper, the angle. Because, the traditional way was horizontal, as you know, horizontal, where the
Mayfac file.
Yeah. And then they went to one where they made the arms more like on a 60-degree angle relative to the horizontal or vertical. And then they went to these really upright ones that are beyond 60 degrees or closer to 90, as you were describing, or closer to zero, I should say, closer to 0 degrees. And those had some of the highest leverage if they were set up correctly, but they diminish leverage as the caliper moves, as it articulates. It quickly decreases. And so the optimal design turned out to be one that was closer to this, like, I don't know, maybe it was 30 degrees from the horizontal versus these upright ones. Like, these were like the touring cantilevers, and they had a ton of leverage if they were exactly set up right. But the leverage would fall off quick either way if you were slightly out of adjustment. Whereas the traditional, like, more level ones, they have a lot more range for being out of, for yoke height and things like that. And the leverage doesn't change as much, and you get more consistent leverage across a wider range of adjustment.
Right. And
so that was a really fascinating discovery.
Yeah. And it's reminding me too, though, like the can of worms of cantilever setup is kind of tricky. Like I almost feel like it's harder than setting up disc brakes. Like setting up a cantilever well I think is a lot harder than setting up a disc brake. I mean, there's always exceptions, but I'm remembering now, like rear brakes are one thing on cantilevers, but I remember sometimes the theory of getting the leverage high and correct, like it doesn't account for things like cantilevers squeal. And sometimes the best leverage scenario is the squealing scenario. Like, so just because it theoretically has high leverage, there's so many issues with how cantilever is like the way it connects, like especially on the front brake. There's like so much squeal involved in those brakes that I feel like it can be a headache, like sending you down that path of like, of getting like really good optimal performance out of cantilever. Like I kind of feel like that's why disc brakes are kind of an easy answer for a lot of people, because if that matters a lot to you, like power and clearance, disc brakes are a great answer. Sometimes it's hard to have all the things. Like, well, obviously we were talking about like Miss Cools is just about got it. She's got the power, it's simple, but the clearance you're kind of missing. So if you go for that like last little bit, that clearance thing, if you go with a longer caliper, you're gonna get way more punch, like, or it's gonna feel more sudden. Maybe she'd be okay with it, but it's like you're always like balancing out all the factors, you know. It's like, so it's kind of interesting. Like part of me wants to go, oh man, I wish I could set up some cantilevers for her so you can get a fender in, but at the same time I'm like, oh yeah, then you're gonna have to deal with this potential squeal problem. Usually with the front brake, and then I can go down that rabbit hole of like, why do cantilever front brakes squeal? And then that whole conversation usually devolves into, these are the best disc brakes.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, then you get into the disc brakes, and you've solved one issue, which was the clearance issue. Virtually, you don't have any clearance issue. But then you're opening up another set of issues, and so you know, which set of issues are you willing to live with, I guess is what it comes to.
Yeah.
And
It's funny you mention it. After watching Miss Cools get this new bike, I reset up one of my bikes to have V brakes, but with the Shimano SLR, Super SLR, which is on the opposite spectrum of what you're doing. They pull a lot of cable relatively. And I wanted to see what would that feel like on my own bike with V brakes set up like Miss Cool style, except my brake levers pulled a lot of cable versus very little. And I've been pretty happy with it for like maybe a few months now. And I recently made a switch to, it started snowing and I needed at least a 3.0 wide tire on the front for getting through some of the snow. So I switched to disc brakes, and I can't stand it. It's so cold out. I can't get them to heat up quick enough to not squeal. Like I got to anticipate when I'm going to brake, heat up my rotors slowly so that by the time I really need them, they're not going to be like honking like geese, you know?
really,
Like, I get there. And they're like, some brakes won't do that maybe, but it's like they're perfectly set up. When it's dry, things are fine. They work great. But when little snow, you know, some moisture lands on them, I got to get the rotors heated up sufficiently, otherwise they'll squeal. And now I'm dealing with that trade-off. Like I got my tire size now, I got my clearance, but now I got this new squeal issue that I'm like, okay, do I got to put new calipers on now? And like, I know I don't have to do anything. Like it's just like some disc brakes in the cold weather are going to squeal. I mean, watch any cyclocross race. Those are pro mechanics working on those things like systematically daily for those riders. And there's still flocks of geese, like sound like flocks of geese coming through those races. That's just the way they sound. Like, I mean, I don't know if you saw Chris Froome's thing recently. Chris Froome is now riding for a new team, and he's riding a new bike, and he's never been on disc brakes before because he's always got to ride that Pinarellos with. Those guys always rode, the Team Sky was always riding rim brakes. And you could tell Chris Froome's trying to like be, cordial and nice about it. It's like to his sponsor, but he's having a hard time saying that these things are junk. Like I hate, like he basically says disc brakes aren't where they have to be. And, the mechanic may mess with it and they'll be okay for a little while. The next thing you know, like, it's like, it's touching here and there. And then he's not into it. He's not into it at all. And I just feel, I thought that was funny because I'm like, that's how it is for me as a mechanic. Like, I know how to make it right. I can make it better. I just don't know how long. Like, I don't know how long it'll last. Like, we can all, like, good mechanics make it good, but then sometimes it's just like picking the best design for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely echo his sentiment because I'm not new to disc brakes. I've had disc brakes. I got a hydraulic disc brake mountain bike in 2009, and it had a set of SRAM Elixir, I think, or Jubilee. I think they were the Jubilees, and then the hydraulic pressure. One day, I was riding down a really steep hill in Marin County at the time, and I lost all braking pressure going downhill. And luckily, I could stop because I could jump off the back of the seat and put my feet down and drag my feet. Yeah, that's how I had to stop. And I took the bike. It was only about a year old. And I was storing the bike upside down where I lived at the time. I had to hang it on a rack on the ceiling. So I was storing it upside down. And so maybe they were the kind of newer version of disc brakes were just coming out. And so maybe they weren't really designed to be upside down like that. And I just did it out of necessity. So I don't know if that contributed to what happened, but I took the bike to the shop and it was still under warranty, and they recalled all those brakes and they replaced them with this. I think they were replaced with the Elixir set. Anyway, so I got all new brakes, and I rode those for a while, and I could not get them to stop squealing at all. And I tried different pads, and they were hydraulic, and I remember I learned how to bleed the brakes and maintain them. And I took them to a shop one time even and had a shop bleed them because I thought maybe I wasn't doing it right. And it was still just a constant battle. So then I took them off. I said, I'm done with SRAM brakes. I'm going to go with Shimano. So I got the Shimano. They're still fairly new. A 9000 series, I think, or is that right? 8000 series?
Like XT or something?
Yeah, XT.
Yeah.
So fairly new. Got the new rotors, new calipers, new brake levers, and they're pretty good. And they were a lot easier to set up. It seemed really easy to set up. I didn't have to buy any special tools or anything. The mechanic at that shop at the time told me how to get the fluid in without one of those special cups, or maybe I bought the plastic cup. But anyway, it wasn't that big of a deal.
Shimano's are so much easier to deal with than SRAM. I feel like when it comes to bleeding them on your own.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it sounds to me like one technique that I think some of us use for sometimes the pressure on a rear brake isn't as good. And so what you do is you like put the bike with a front wheel hanging from a hook, and then you clamp a strap around the brake lever and just leave it overnight. And something about the way the bubbles will rise up out of that, and you'll get your brake to kind of firm up. And if you do the opposite, hang it from both wheels, sometimes those bubbles travel
up.
Yeah, so I feel like if your brakes are especially low on fluid and you hang your bike upside down and then you don't ride it for a while and then you go to ride it, I imagine sometimes you'll get a surprise once. Yeah, especially maybe something about the heat of the, a long descent. Yeah, you might get a surprise. But I was gonna say, like, I still know that disc brakes are the ultimate performer, though they're not at all the same. Like it's similar to brake levers. Like when you say this worked and that didn't, or this is awesome and that sucks, it's always kind of comes down to, well, which system did you ride, and how was it set up? And for example, your old elixirs are like nothing compared to like a newer XT, or maybe even newer SRAM guides or something.
Yeah.
Or the new Shimano road brakes are pretty amazing. Like, but there's gonna be these, like, if I could, I wish I could let you and Therese ride that. It'd be cool to have you try that polyvalent out with like a set of like the Ultegra or 105 full hydraulic setup, or even Tiagra is really good, but it doesn't feel at all how you had it set up with the Motoko brake and the SLR lever. Like, it's such a different disc brake. Like it might as well just be a different system. Like, it's not even, but
well, that setup works really well. It's just that it doesn't have a lot of room for adjustment. You know, as the pads wear and the rotors wear, there's not a lot you can do with it. So it has really good braking power when you first get it all set up, and it feels excellent. It's just that over time, as the pads wear and then that piston in that caliper starts to get further towards, you know, the rotor.
Well, I mean, this is a perfectly good point. Like, if cable actuated versus full hydraulic, with like a full hydraulic setup, you'll get a sort of like, it'll reset its distance. So you can keep wearing the pads down. And sometimes you'll notice there's a lot extra throw in the lever, but for the most part, you don't have to really keep like tinkering with it, or you shouldn't. Actually does make me, I have a feeling with people like Chris Froome, with so much power and such a light bike, that to me is like worth like asking, like, when you're getting rubbing problems with your disc brake, like, is your fork so light that it can't handle the stiffness of how much power and torque you're putting through it? Like, because that has a big effect on if you're going to hear noise from your disc or not.
Yeah.
And if you ride a heavier bike, which he doesn't want to do, that might solve his problems with the disc rubbing and sounds issue.
Yeah.
But it's not going to solve his problems with going uphill fast. So it's like, I think, well, I'm kind of just saying, keep an open mind about all the systems, because a lot of times it just comes down to what system do you have and how is it set up. And with like Therese's bike, we were going for an old school look with the new disc brake. Like, that old lever had a lot of power, and I wanted that was like a good thing to have, I feel like, for her. And yet that brake, it's kind of hard to find a brake that actually works really well with that lever, the disc brake. I still don't actually know which one would have worked better than the Motoko. It's like, I think they're all kind of, you're gonna have to tinker with this one.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. I mean, the brakes on that bike do work really well. And we did one time we actually were doing a brake comparison where we would both ride side by side, and then I was riding my Cantilever touring bike with really short cantilevers. These were the old Mayfax that had the really short arms, so there was very little leverage. And I just had to, I just grabbed them as hard as I could. And we did it on a rainy day. And it was surprising. Like, the cantilever bike, I had to pull hard for sure. But I could stop the bike in about the same distance that she could, when we were side by side. So, and it was a little bit wet that day. We were trying to do it on a rainy day when, traction is the argument is always that disc brakes are better in the rain. And so I wanted to see for myself, let's go try it. And it was wet. It wasn't pouring down rain, but the road was wet, and my rim was dry mostly. The tire was wet, but the rim was dry.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's exactly what I mean, though. It's like, what were the conditions? Because if the rim's dry, It doesn't matter how wet it is outside.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I mean, without saying all those little details, like your rim is dry, it's kind of, you can kind of pull off an easy, like if you're trying to steer someone away from disc brakes, be like, yeah, look, see, they're not that good.
Yeah.
But then like, well, the conditions don't really say that
Yeah.
the full
Well,
story.
I don't want people to think I'm
steering them away from disc brakes. I think disc brakes are great, and I think they're especially great on a mountain bike, especially with a suspension fork, because you've already have such a rigid fork to begin with that I don't see why you would need why, if you're trying to save so much weight with the rim brake on a fork that's so big and stiff already and heavy, it's kind of, it seems like a waste of energy to try to do that. And on a mountain bike, you're riding very technical stuff. You're going off big drops and going over rocks, and so to be able to have that type of braking is absolutely necessary if you're doing that kind of riding.
Yeah, and that's another thing I remember in the later 90s, like kind of watching this increase in how many like blown up rims we were getting, like rims that were worn so thin the sidewall would just, or like that the rim would just explode off the side or they would crack.
Wow.
But because the new brake lever, the new V brake had so much leverage, and people were taking them mountain biking. So you combine the extra power, the extra friction with the extra dirt and the extra dirt water in the puddles that's going into there. It's a recipe for pretty, immediate disaster. You're not going to get very far riding like that without just destroying your rims, which I feel like I agree with mountain biking. Disc brake, you can talk you can talk about all the bad things, but man, they're saving you from like having to replace your rims every year.
Yeah.
And there's other reasons why you'll blow up your rims now. You're running too low pressure in your tubeless tires or something.
Yeah.
But the cool thing about that is you can dent the shit out of your rims now in disc brakes and just keep rolling. If you did that with your mountain bike from the V brake era, you'd feel that bump in your every time. So there's a lot of merits to that type of riding with a disc. But yeah, for me, I feel like I'm not riding that aggro at all like anymore. That I find so much like left to be desired in a well-constructed or well-designed rim brake that fits all these new tires we can play with now. Like I basically want it to be as simple as a side pull roadie brake with the same amount of like power that they have now, but have clearance. And that's like a unicorn brake to me. Like I guess you could say it's the Rene Air type brake, but I really like the simplicity of just like no yokes, no center pulls, no center pull cable stops. Like I don't know why. I just like, I wish we could just actually, let me show you something real quick. If you got 1 second.
Yeah, we got lots of time, Omar.
This is the brake.
All we've got is time. So
this is the brake I just put on our cargo bike. It's like, I don't know how long this thing is. This is like 97 reach or something.
wow.
Bro, it's like, this is like a cyclocross length fork. It's like a 395 axle to crown, and this squeezes a 650B in the middle of the slot.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
A humongous. Here's like a coffee cup. Here. Let's see here.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
So that's easily a 2-inch tire easily. Yeah.
Yeah, after I got it around my 3-inch tires, just kind of hypothetically, I'm like, I mean, you might call it, it's not the prettiest thing, but it's also not the ugliest thing. But I kind of feel like it would be nice to see something like this, like in a refined way. But it's got that issue still. Like, say you want to open up the brake, see how the top down, but it's just still, it's so big that anyway, I put a hub motor on the front of the cargo bike, so I had to ditch our old brake.
Yeah.
There's no disc brake mount, so I put one of these on there to make up for it, and it's just cavernous. It's just like, it's kind of amazing, and it works really good. So,
And it's interesting because I'm looking at that articulation, and if I'm imagining my rim on there, which I think is a 23 millimeter wide rim, it looks like you're going to be hitting that rim with a slight upward force.
yeah, it's like asking for a wide rim.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking also, somebody sent me a link
to, and I don't know if you've already seen this, but somebody sent me a link to a hydraulic rim brake. Have you seen these yet?
Magura?
I think it is.
It is. I think it is. Yeah.
I work on those almost every day because they're on a lot of like Dutch commuter bikes.
Yeah.
A really high power brake that doesn't have a ton of trouble getting parked next to a million other commuters like a disc brake would. So yeah.
Oh, is that why they do it? Because it's a matter of parking?
I think so. I mean, it's not as high cost. You can use a regular rim. They're finicky as heck.
Are they?
They're very finicky. You gotta, yeah. It's sort of almost a joke in a way how often it's like Rochambeau, is this gonna work? And like, meaning just if you're complaining about disc brake pistons like not being, like sometimes they push out and then sometimes the other one pushes out more.
Yeah.
The Maguras are sort of notorious for that. You can clean them out and usually straighten things out pretty good, but it's a constant, like, yeah. They work pretty good, but yeah. But what happens is the pistons, which is the parts that move inward toward the rotor, like that are behind the pads, when dirt gets in there, usually it evens out because there's equalized force. Like this one can't move more than this one as long as the friction is the same. But once you get dirt in there, like more dirt in this one, the friction will be different so that they won't move the same. And then you'll get these, like, sometimes you'll get people constantly like moving their caliper over and over and over until because the one piston just gets more stubborn and the other one just does all the moving. And after a while, your whole caliper, you've moved it over like 2 millimeters.
Oh, okay.
And then what you got to do at some point is just push the pistons back out, clean them up, get them to, I mean, it's not impossible. It's not like super tedious, but you have to, I'm just saying that with the Maguras, it's like, it's almost like a gigantic hydraulic brake because it's going around a rim instead of a rotor.
Right.
And just the way those pads get stuck, like those pistons can get stuck. And I mean, you brought it up, and I immediately I like know that Magura rim brake pretty well, but yeah, it works good when you know braking wise, but like, yeah, I almost prefer just a regular V brake myself.
Yeah. Well, good. That leads me in. I'll end it on this last question, which is, do you think the future of bicycling or cycling, do you think the future is going to be disc brakes and eventually we will fade away rim brakes? They will be long gone to the dustbin of history, or are they going to be around as long as there are bicycles? What is your prediction, Omar?
I feel like that's less of like better technology, like you know, one, or like a Darwinian type thing, and more of like, what do we choose? What do we want? So I have a feeling, well, no, it's not what we want. It's kind of what does business want for us?
Yeah.
We go along with it. And right now, who's going to win? It's business, what business wants for us, and it's going to be disc brakes. Unless, like with a lot of things, there's a counterculture and a little bit of revolution, which there always seems to be. Like old music always becomes new again. And, you know, it's like, we tend to see value in the opposite,
Yeah.
and that's kind of what we're talking about here. You're kind of drawing attention to the merits of old designs, and I feel like there's a lot to be gained by. I think there's more to be discovered by making a better rim brake personally, especially to adapt it to this sort of modern rediscovery of large volume tires.
Yeah.
Like we didn't really get a chance to work on that one, I feel like, very much, because disc brakes took over and they answer the tire volume, the clearance problem very well. I just feel like there's something so cool about an old bike that's been like sitting there or handed down, and knowing it'll still work if you replace the cables, versus like a bike that's handed down and you 20 years later that cable, that hydraulic system's obsolete. Like there's something about that, the fact that disc brakes haven't stopped changing, that makes me feel like I would almost want to start back where we left off in like the 90s and keep going on a rim brake. I don't know why. Like I just feel like it's so simple. I wish my days were quieter sometimes, because yeah, my right now my disc brakes, I feel like until the summer comes and until I get a lot more dust on my rotors and break in my
Uh-oh. I think we lost him.
froze.
Yeah, it froze.
I don't know where it stopped, but
You said until you get more dust on your rotors and get them broken in.
oh yeah, I feel like my my disc brakes are going to be pretty squealy this winter, but or unless I change them, I just don't have a whole lot of time to keep experimenting with every disc brake down there. But I mean, they work. My brakes work great. I stop, and when they're dry, they're quiet. But I don't know. I just like pushing this issue of like what things that worked well, and like let's not forget or something, and let's pick up where we left off, because I don't feel like, I don't know, I'm not like in that point where I'm like, yeah, disc brakes are the future. I know that's what's going to be dictated for us, unless like a new technology, like maybe the new roller drum brake. Who knows? Maybe they're going to like make improvements to the drum brake. I don't know.
Yeah.
In what case I kind of like the idea of, I mean, the idea of an exposed rotor to me is a bit like the derailleur. Derailleurs are great, but man, they're vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're very vulnerable, and with friction shifting, there's less probably of an issue. But with all this indexing now, it's like I'm constantly having to. Derailleur hangers are always bent.
Yeah.
Knowing like if you follow like Tumbleweed, Daniel Malloy's brand Tumbleweed bicycles, look at that bike. That one's like kind of a interesting study in like what works really well for a long time.
Yeah.
And they're running disc brakes, but like kind of on getting out of the brake conversation, he uses like the roll off speed hub.
Okay.
And gets completely eliminates that derailleur vulnerability. And you see the kinds of rides they take those things on. And Daniel's a big dude. He's not going to be super gentle on the equipment, but those things, like, yeah, they hold up really well. And I feel like, well, with the disc brake thing, I feel like that can't be the end of it. That can't be the height of braking. Something that vulnerable, something when you sneeze on it, it might start squealing. That can't be it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've noticed with the modern disc brakes on road bikes,
there's this incredible effort to try to reduce the weight of every part of the disc brake system, because it does add weight to the bike, and compared to a rim brake bike that's been optimized for years down to the the UCI weight limit, And that became so easy with the rim brake bike that they were literally adding weight back to bikes just to make sure they were at the 15-pound limit before the races started. Well, with disc brakes, that problem is now it's back into the problem again, where we're trying to get a disc brake bike down to that 15 pounds. So if you look at the rotors, and you look at all the parts of the rotor that are cut out and removed to save weight, that rotor is so thin and so flexible, and there's no mass to dissipate any of the heat, that of course it's going to warp. And that's going to be one of those issues that it's going to take a lot of really fine-tuning that design to make it perfect. And then to your point, well, okay, but then it's still exposed, and there's still those issues of what if you bump it into something. Maybe a pro racer at a bike race doesn't have to worry so much about that, because if they crash, they can replace their bike with a different one and finish the race. Whereas you and I, we're out riding and we go to the cafe and we knock it over and we bend the rim or bend the rotor. We're going to be over there fussing around trying to get it good enough to get home. So it's more like you said, it's a little more vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that's what's what to me is like the beauty of a bike is how accessible and simple it is. And what I feel like happens with technology is things progress, but they progress in the direction of this is our problem to solve for you, not yours to solve for you. And with bikes, I feel like there's something nice about just being able to go, I can see it, I can fix it, did it. But when the technology becomes like you're so dependent on someone solving your problems for you, I feel like you've overshot something about the bike. Like, and now it's sort of like, it's not the same. It's lost that spirit of this simple thing that you can, that's accessible. That's sort of the beauty of it. It's like so simple, so light, like, so it doesn't require that much material to make something good and to make something work. Like there's almost like this middle ground of like, that's so perfect. That's like not too much, not too little. And I feel like the bike industry tends to magnify certain priorities that aren't my priorities. Like stopping, like going from 30 miles an hour down to 15 in the rain. Like that's not really my problem. That's like not what I'm looking for. And so if you like notice, if you just try to stay away from marketing and media and just kind of listen to what this bike needs to be for you, I feel like that's what they don't want you to do. They want you to like think that you need what they're telling you need. And I kind of, could talk about that with other things, but I feel like that's what's sort of tarnished about a lot of the bike world to me, which is I think why starting this all-rounder thing was fun for me, because I'm like, what if I just said, that's not the direction out. That's not what I want to listen to. What if I just said, I just want to listen to what I know is true about a bike, and what would it look like? And it's kind of hard to do as a business because you're catering to people who are being marketed to. And it's hard you can't argue with someone's desire to want to go biking, but everybody wants the new tubeless 650B, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, yeah, I mean, you have to, it's hard to be a purist, like about what I think is great, but I mean, your bike kind of encapsulates what I think is like kind of a nice direction, like simple, accessible. Although I kind of feel like it'd be nice if that was even more accessible. A bike like yours.
I agree.
Just maybe like that's just what a bike is, not like fancy, like Rene Ayres Compass. Like it doesn't, I mean, yours is a great bike, and there's going to be like a time and place for people to be like, hey, let's go down and get a custom made frame. But I kind of just feel like that would be nice if those principles are just brought down to like this is what a like where hybrids are. Like they just threw hybrids at people, and there's like all these hybrids hanging out in garages. They're kind of ugly, but they're functional. I kind of just wish that like bikes that were just like good all around bikes, like the basic principles that was just like brought down to the level of like the $5,000 to $1,000 bike. Like when you get in that level, you're not just buying some hard to formed aluminum wannabe superhero junky bike with a tourney derailleur on it. Like actually I kind of like tourney derailleurs, but like something about like just keeping it pure, like just keeping it like a beautifully simple, elegant machine and not making a fuss. But that's not the direction the industry is going to go. So
Wow.
You said that. I couldn't have said it better. You said that so well. I think you really nailed it.
I mean, it's interesting. I'll send you the Froome interview where he says, he kind of goes on about like how he doesn't like this technology. It's not where it needs to be. But then he goes, but you should get on them because you're going to get forced to ride them at some point. So you should ride them. And it's like, he's kind of confusing. He's like, it's almost like he's divided between staying true to what he knows. And if he were to do that, he'd probably be happy just back on a rim brake bike. Thank you. But he has a sponsor. And so he has to be a spokesman for that. And so I feel like there's this weird tension between business and innovation, like profit motive versus, I don't know. It's in all of us because we all got to pay rent. Like on the most basic level, there's a profit motive with all of us. Like we got to pay the bills, And for some people, they got to do more than pay the bills. They got to pay for more stuff than just like basic rent. But I don't know. I just feel like there will always be this tension between like profit motive, design, and like just pursuit of beauty and truth.
Yeah.
Design. So I think that, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm listening. You can keep talking. I just have to switch out this battery.
I don't have a real sophisticated studio. And this is actually the first time, this video will be the first kind of conversation like this video that I've made. So there will certainly be technical glitches.
Well, yeah. I mean, this isn't the first time we've like went on and on about everything.
Yeah.
I don't know how you edit this stuff, man. But
well,
it's sometimes, it's fun to make the really edited videos where, we go out and kind of have a plan figured out in advance of what we kind of want to do. And then come back and take that stuff and edit it and cut out all the, all the parts where we're cringing, getting too cringy. But saving some cringe because, cringe sells. Cringe is people like the cringe. So we keep a little bit.
Actually that sums up where I feel like where our world is at right now. Cringe sells, and that's where we're at.
Yeah.
And we're all just like like freaked out, and in the meanwhile we're being sold something to capture, and
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Let's call it a day.
Yeah, no, this was a lot of fun, Omar, and I want to thank you very much for doing this. I know it takes a lot of time out of your day to stop and have this conversation. So
winter time, it's a good thing to do in the winter time. Things really slow down here for bike shops in Michigan, like snow. People slow down, and I got a day off, so happy to talk about stuff with you today.
That's cool. Yeah, and there was a lot of things I wanted to talk about that we didn't get to, like but maybe we'll save that one for another time if there's more interest in doing this kind of longer format conversation stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we can.
Yeah. Good luck finding the nuggets and
Yeah.
coming up with a good format to present it.
Yeah.
Yes,
Let's see how
get it out.
goes.
Yeah, we'll see how this one goes, and then we'll have a little more understanding on how to make it better next time. But
yeah, I already feel like I got like some other things I want to go down, just go down the rabbit hole with too.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's
All right.
do it. Yeah, for sure. All right, I'm gonna stop this one.
and then I'm gonna stop this one. So thanks again, Omar. Have a nice rest of the week.
Okay, Jeremy. Say hi to Miss Cools.
I will.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Easy.